126 overtakes. That was the headline Formula One wanted you to see after the 2026 Australian Grand Prix. The most passes in a single dry race in the sport's history. Proof that the new regulations were delivering exactly as promised, a new era of close racing, active aerodynamics and wheel-to-wheel action at Albert Park. At least that is what everyone thought, because within hours of the checkered flag, the drivers who produced those 126 overtakes started saying something very different. The reigning world champion called the cars the worst ever made in Formula One. A four-time champion mocked the energy management system on live television, and the most successful driver in the sport's history said the qualifying format was completely against what Formula One is about. Meanwhile, fans flooded social media, calling the passes phantom overtakes, position swaps driven by battery depletion rather than driving skill. IndyCar's Chip Ganassi Racing even trolled Formula One by listing terms like battery management and downshifting on straights, before adding that they do not do that, they just race. The post went viral within hours. So how did we get here? And how did a sport generating nearly $4 billion a year end up in a public war with the 20 drivers who are supposed to be its biggest selling point? The 2025 cars were, by most accounts, the best Formula One machines ever built. Fast, stable, capable of following through high-speed corners, and genuinely difficult to drive at the limit. Drivers and fans loved them equally. The racing was close, and the overtaking felt earned. The 2026 regulations aim to build on that success while also reshaping the sport's environmental and commercial future. What they actually built was something very different. The 2026 power unit regulations changed the fundamental balance of the cars. The new regulations tripled the electric motor output, jumping it from 120 kilowatts to 350 kilowatts. Roughly 470 brake horsepower from electric power alone. The rulemakers also killed the old heat energy recovery unit, the component that quietly managed energy flow between the turbo and the battery for the previous decade, to lower the barrier for new manufacturers. And it worked on that front. Audi, Honda, Ford and General Motors all signed up largely because of these rules. The cars also got new active aerodynamics, replacing the old drag reduction system with movable front and rear wings that switch between corner mode for maximum downforce and straight line mode for minimum drag on designated zones. The concept sounded like the future of racing, but here is the detail that everyone missed at the time. The battery cannot sustain full electric deployment for an entire straight on most circuits. When the energy runs out mid-straight, the car loses roughly half its power in an instant. Drivers call this clipping, and it creates speed differentials of 30 to 50 kilometers per hour between cars that have energy and cars that do not on the same piece of track at the same time. Picture two cars side by side on the main straight at Albert Park. One has battery charge remaining, the other has just run out. Within a few hundred meters, there is a gap opening up between them that has nothing to do with driver skill, car setup, or tyre management. It is pure battery luck, dictated by what happened 3 corners earlier. On top of that, drivers have to lift off the throttle hundreds of meters before braking zones just to harvest energy through regenerative braking. This technique, called lift and coast, means drivers are actively slowing down in sections where the old cars would have been flat out. Lewis Hamilton reported lifting and coasting for 600 meters per qualifying lap during the Barcelona test. I mean, think about that for a second. 600 meters of a qualifying lap where a Formula One driver is deliberately not pushing. In qualifying. The session that is supposed to be the rawest expression of pure speed in the entire weekend. That is not what anyone signed up to watch. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Removing the heat recovery unit saved manufacturers' development costs and complexity. It also removed the one component that made the old power units so efficient at managing energy invisibly. Without it, energy management became the driver's problem instead of the engine's problem. And that single technical choice is the root of everything that has gone wrong since Melbourne. Someone saw this coming. Multiple drivers raised alarms during the Bahrain pre-season test in February, and the concerns were loud enough that the FIA started scrambling for band-aid fixes before a single competitive lap had even been run. But the scale of what happened at Albert Park caught everyone off guard. Max Verstappen came out of pre-season testing and branded the new car's Formula E on steroids and anti-racing. He said he could not drive naturally because every lap was an exercise in using the throttle as little as possible to save the battery. After crashing out of Q1 at the Australian Grand Prix due to a rear axle lock that required X-rays on both hands, he recovered from 20th to 6th in the race, a drive that in any other era would have been the headline of the weekend. Instead, the headline was what happened on his formation lap. Verstappen's battery drained completely during the parade lap to the grid, leaving him with zero electric power at the race start. He sat on the grid, watching every other car pull away from him under full deployment while he had nothing. He described the experience as sitting in a go-kart, watching Formula One cars disappear into the distance. And yet, he still recovered 14 places on raw pace and racecraft alone. Despite that recovery, Verstappen sat in the media pen afterward and described feeling completely empty regardless of where he finished. He said the sport should be proper Formula One on steroids, and what he got instead was more management, more buttons, more conservation. When asked about his future, he offered a flat warning that drivers can only take so much. That is a 5-time world champion publicly questioning whether he wants to keep racing. In the second event of the season, and he doubled down in a follow-up session saying he did not want Formula One to be close to Formula E, and that the sport needed to find more power and more speed, not more management. Lando Norris went further. After cautiously defending the cars during testing, he admitted at Melbourne that he had only done so to see what other drivers said first. When asked whether these cars represented an improvement, his answer landed like a hammer. He said Formula One had gone from the best cars ever made to probably the worst. And no, I am not making that up. A journalist then asked if he enjoyed anything about the new experience. Norris paused for 7 full seconds of dead silence before answering with 2 words. Not really. His post-race safety warning was the most alarming statement of the entire weekend. He called it chaos and predicted that when someone hits another car at a 30 to 50 km/h speed differential, that car is going to fly and go over the fence. The reigning world champion, talking about barrier-clearing impacts, not theoretical concerns from a simulator report. Fernando Alonso, 44 years old and in his 23rd Formula One season, brought the sharpest edge of all. He noted that energy management forced drivers to crawl through certain corners at 200 km/h instead of 260, and then said a chef could drive the car through those sections at that speed. That might be the single best one-liner of the 2026 season so far. Carlos Sainz at Williams, who is also a director of the Grand Prix Drivers Association, branded the straight-line mode dangerous and a plaster on top of a deeper engine problem. Oliver Bearman at Haas said the boost button made it feel like he was in Formula One while everyone else was in Formula 2, and he called it Formula E, not racing. Sergio Perez, returning to the grid with the new Cadillac team after a year away from competition, said he had found a very different Formula One, and one that was a lot less fun than what he remembered. Even the rookies were not spared. Arvid Lindblad at Racing Bulls described the constant energy management as pretty painful, and Charles Leclerc, who actually won the race for Ferrari, compared the overtaking to the mushroom in Mario Kart on his team radio mid-battle with Russell for the lead. A clip that went instantly viral and crystallised what fans were already feeling. When the race winner is comparing your sport to a video game while winning it, you have a problem that runs deeper than teething issues. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains everything about the dynamic between the drivers and Formula One management right now. George Russell won that race from pole position in a Mercedes 1-2 finish, and his reaction was the opposite of everyone else on the grid. He pushed back at the criticism, said everyone was too quick to judge, and implied that the unhappy drivers were simply the ones whose cars were not fast enough. Russell would look back on Melbourne and wish he had made a different call about one thing only, because that comment positioned him against virtually every other driver on the grid and complicated his role as a Grand Prix Drivers Association director at exactly the moment when organised pushback was building. Even Russell, though, requested that the FIA make the front-wing transition into straight mode less aggressive, citing significant understeer when following other cars. So even the weekend's biggest winner was filing safety complaints. Up to this point, the story had been about drivers venting frustration after a difficult weekend. That was about to flip, because Stefano Domenicali decided to respond publicly, and the way he did it poured fuel on a fire that was already burning. During the Bahrain test, Domenicali's tone was measured. He told media he did not feel the anxiety that the paddock was projecting, that new regulations always bring doubt, and that everyone should stay calm. Fine. Reasonable enough for February. His tone at Melbourne was different. In a Sky Sports interview with Martin Brundle on race day, Domenicali directly addressed the Verstappen and Hamilton criticism and said he thought it was wrong, in general terms, to talk bad about an incredible world that allows all of them to grow. He framed energy management as an evolution of driving and argued that the best driver would simply prove to be the fastest under the new rules. He defended the manufacturer's strategy by pointing out that sustainable fuel and electrification were what attracted new constructors to the sport. Not that great. Because what Domenicali essentially told the 20 best racing drivers on the planet was that their lived experience inside the car was less valid than the boardroom logic that designed the regulations. Multiple outlets characterized his stance as burying his head in the sand. Toto Wolff paraphrased Domenicali's private position more bluntly, saying the single metric that mattered to the Formula One chief was whether the fans liked it. And the fan reaction, as the comment sections and social media firestorm made painfully clear, was not what Domenicali hoped for. The optics of the Formula One chief executive, publicly calling his biggest stars wrong, while the FIA was simultaneously executing emergency rule changes in the background, did not exactly project confidence or coherence. It projected an organisation that was arguing with itself in public. What comes next is the part that still does not make sense to a lot of people, because the FIA's own actions during Melbourne weekend directly contradicted Domenicali's message of calm. The most dramatic episode happened on Saturday morning, after driver Gabriel Bortoleto at Audi raised concerns during Friday's briefing that he could barely make it through a flat-out section between turns 8 and 9 in straight-line mode. The FIA unilaterally removed straight mode zone 4 from the Melbourne circuit ahead of third practice, citing safety. The FIA notified teams late on Friday night with no consultation. The reaction was instant and unanimous. Teams protested that all their Friday data would be invalidated and that setup changes made overnight were based on having that zone active. Simulation data showed the 2026 cars could end up 50 km per hour slower than Formula 3 cars at the Turn 9 entry, without that zone. And the drivers, who rarely agree on anything, came together with a unified response rejecting the change. Less than 1 hour before third practice, the FIA reversed itself entirely, issuing a statement that it had rescinded the decision following feedback from teams and drivers. 1 hour, that is how long a safety-motivated rule change survived contact with the actual paddock. The FIA made a call, the entire grid said no, and the governing body folded before the session even started. And that was only the beginning of the weekend's reactive fixes. The FIA also slashed qualifying energy recovery from 8.5 megajoules to 7 to curb extreme harvesting tactics on flying laps, where some drivers were deliberately crawling through entire sectors to charge the battery for one fast section. They banned straight-line mode activation at race starts because closing speeds into turn 1 were dangerously high, with cars in straight mode arriving at braking points up to 40 km per hour faster than cars in corner mode. They added 5 seconds to the pre-start procedure so the turbos could spool up without the deleted heat recovery unit after multiple cars stalled or bogged down on the grid in testing. Pirelli increased rear tyre pressures by 2.5 psi to handle the violent load dynamics created by active aerodynamics switching between modes mid-corner, and a unanimous team vote closed a Mercedes compression ratio loophole where rivals alleged the engine exceeded the legal limit when hot through thermal expansion, imposing hot state checks from June. 5 reactive fixes and 1 overnight reversal in the span of a single race weekend. If Domenicali's message was stay calm and trust the process, the FIA's actions were saying something very different. The Grand Prix Drivers Association has not yet issued a formal statement specifically about the 2026 regulations, but the institutional groundwork for one is clearly being laid. Russell and Sainz are both directors of the association, which was originally founded in 1961 and has historically intervened at critical moments in the sport's history. From safety campaigns in the 1960s to the open letter criticising FIA President Mohammed Ben Sulayem that all 20 drivers signed in November 2024. Hamilton called for drivers to consider unionising beyond the association back in 2025, stating publicly that drivers do not hold a power seat at the table and that needs to change. The association created an Instagram account last year, its first social media presence in its entire existence, and the unified driver response that killed the Melbourne straight mode change showed that when the grid speaks as one voice, the FIA folds immediately. Russell's position is the most interesting to watch going forward. He won the race, he pushed back at the criticism, and yet he is a director of the very organisation that is laying the groundwork for collective action against the rules that benefited him most. If the Chinese Grand Prix produces the same energy management complaints and the same phantom overtakes, Russell's ability to stay neutral collapses. He either sides with his fellow drivers, or he sides with the regulations that gave him a 1-2 finish, and either choice costs him something. And this next part is the one that even the regulator's supporters cannot defend. Formula One's automated moderation system on social media reportedly filtered over 1,000 critical fan comments after the Australian Grand Prix. The official account promoted the 126 overtakes as proof the regulations were working. And when fans pushed back, calling them phantom passes, the comments disappeared. Formula One denied manual removal and blamed an artificial intelligence tool designed to catch abuse that inadvertently suppressed legitimate criticism. Fan sites accused the sport of running a digital censorship operation. Whether it was intentional or not, the perception damage was immediate and severe. Formula One had just experienced the most controversial regulation change in years, and instead of engaging with the backlash, it appeared to be silencing it. The broader fan reaction has been just as hostile. The Mario Kart comparison from Leclerc's team radio became the dominant meme within hours, turning up in podcasts, YouTube thumbnails, and rival series marketing. IndyCar leaned into it directly. Chip Ganassi Racing posted a graphic listing battery management, downshifting on straights, and energy harvesting before adding that they do not do any of that and just race. The post racked up millions of impressions. When your direct competitor is using your own regulations as a punchline, you have a brand problem. And that brand problem has commercial weight behind it. Now, this is not the first time Formula One has faced a crisis over new regulations. And how those earlier episodes played out tells you almost exactly what is going to happen next. In 2005, Michelin could not guarantee tyre safety through the banked Turn 13 at Indianapolis. The FIA refused every compromise, including a temporary chicane supported by 9 of 10 teams. Only 6 cars raced. Fans threw bottles at the podium. Formula One lost the American market for 5 years. The lesson there was brutal. Rigid refusal to act when safety is at stake causes lasting damage that takes years to repair. In 2014, when the sport switched from screaming V8 engines to quieter turbo-hybrid V6s, the backlash was enormous. Bernie Ecclestone declared himself horrified. Race promoters threatened to pull contracts. Fans complained bitterly. The FIA investigated louder alternatives and then changed absolutely nothing. The controversy faded on its own once competitive battles recaptured attention. The lesson there was the lesson. Opposite, some complaints resolve themselves if the on-track product is strong enough. And in 2022, ground effect cars produced violent aerodynamic bouncing called porpoising. Hamilton was visibly hobbling after the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. The FIA issued a technical directive setting oscillation limits, then implemented floor changes for the following season that eliminated the problem entirely. The whole cycle took roughly 6 months from crisis to resolution, and the FIA is almost certainly using that playbook right now. March 9th, 2026. The day after the race, FIA single-seater director Nicholas Tombazis confirmed that a formal review of the energy management data will take place after the Chinese Grand Prix this weekend. He hinted that ready-made solutions exist, describing them as aces up the sleeve that the FIA deliberately held back to avoid knee-jerk reactions before the first race. The most likely first change is an increase in the super clipping power limit from 250 kilowatts to 350, which would allow more energy harvesting at full throttle and reduce how much drivers need to lift and coast. Another option under consideration is decreasing peak deployment power or boosting the internal combustion engine output to shift the balance back toward traditional power delivery. Critically, these are all software-controlled adjustments that require no hardware modifications, meaning they can be implemented between races without any team needing to rebuild components. Changes could arrive as early as the Japanese Grand Prix on March 29th, giving the FIA a 3-race window of data from Melbourne, Shanghai and Suzuka before the European season begins. That timeline matters more than people realise. The European races are where Formula One's biggest sponsors activate trackside hospitality. They are where the highest television audiences tune in across the core European markets. And they are where the sport's commercial partners expect the product to look like the spectacle they paid for. If the energy management problems are still producing Mario Kart racing and driver complaints at the Spanish Grand Prix in May, the conversation shifts from teething problems to structural failure. And at that point, the fixes available become much harder and much more expensive. But here is what nobody in the paddock wants to say out loud. Even if the post-China tweaks reduce lift and coast by 20 or 30%, the fundamental character of these regulations is not going to change overnight. The 50-50 power split is baked into the architecture. The deleted heat recovery unit is not coming back. And the manufacturers who entered the sport on the basis of these rules have contractual expectations about the technical framework they signed up to. Audi did not spend hundreds of millions of euros developing a power unit for these regulations, only to have the regulations rewritten around them mid-season. Formula One enters this crisis from a position of extraordinary commercial strength. Revenue hit $3.87 billion in 2025, up 14% year-on-year. Sponsorship spending is projected to exceed $3 billion for the first time this season. Apple TV launched its exclusive American broadcast deal. No sponsor withdrawals have been reported. But the growth trajectory that Liberty Media has built since 2017 depends on one thing above all else, and that is the on-track product. If the cars do not convince, if the racing feels artificial, if the drivers keep telling the world that they are not having fun, that trajectory stalls. You cannot sell a sport as the pinnacle of motorsport, while the people driving the cars say they would rather not be there. The real question is not whether the FIA will fix the energy management. They will. They always do. The real question is whether Formula One can fix these regulations fast enough to keep the drivers from doing something nobody has seen before, something organised, something formal, something that makes the 2025 open letter to the FIA president look like a polite suggestion. The car might be fast enough, but is the sport?